So we're in the season of Lent right now, a season of preparation for Easter, and this is our Lent series, 24 Hours That Changed the World. It's based on a book by Adam Hamilton. One of our one groups is discussing. Another one's discussing a book by Richard Rohr called Everything Belongs. You can check information out there about those at the Information Center. And our special guest today, Josh Scott, is going to be continuing this 24-hour series, but also working in his own story. And that's super important because Josh is leading a church very similar to One Church, only he's doing it in Kentucky. And if you know anything about Kentucky, I was born in Ohio, about a county away from West Virginia and Kentucky. And it's an atmosphere where I grew up, and in some ways like the Southeast Valley, but probably even more so, where it's a very difficult journey to lead a church like this in that kind of an area. And so Josh has the scars to prove it. And he's going to be talking about a little bit of his story today. So again, no matter what your story is, whatever you're walking in with, a tough time, maybe a challenging time, you're going to hear from somebody today who has the courage to do what he believes is right and to love people instead of fighting, but keep on doing that even when he's attacked, even when people are posting weird things on Facebook, right? And so you're going to hear from somebody today who has the courage, the fortitude to live that kind of a life. And he's encouraging to all of us. And so also Josh is 6'7", so you're all going to feel like you sat too close to the movie screen today. You know what I mean? Like just kind of recline, make your seat recline as much as possible, and you're going to reach for popcorn occasionally. But I'm so excited to hear from Josh. He has such good stuff to share. Brother from a different mother, right? Taller, better looking brother from a different mother. And so I want to give him a quick formal introduction, and then we're going to invite Josh up. So Joshua Scott serves as the lead pastor of Morgantown Community Church in Morgantown, Kentucky. Josh began vocational ministry in 1997 and has served on staff at MCC since March 2005. Shortly after moving to Morgantown, he married Carla, and they have one amazing son, Cohen. And Josh earned an MA in Religious Studies from Western Kentucky University. He also holds a BA from Eastern Kentucky University. In addition, he teaches religion courses at both Western Kentucky and Sky KCTCS. Some of his favorite things are spending time with his family, watching The Office, drinking good coffee, and cheering for the West Virginia University football team. So let's welcome our better-looking, taller brother from a different mother, Josh. Come on up, man.
Thanks, man. Thank you. Good morning. Oh, it is great to see you. It's all downhill after that introduction. I don't know who he's talking about at all. It's great to be here. It's my first time in Arizona, and in Kentucky, it has been cold and snowy, and so Cohen and I, that's my boy Cohen, he has never been on a trip with me, and this one just worked, so we had a great time. It's really fortunate because there's a Chuck E. Cheese right next to our hotel, so yeah, I don't know what you did last night, but I can tell you what I did last night. So yeah, we're thrilled to be here, and I just think I just have so much respect and admiration for Ryan, and I've known him for about a year now. We met through a network we're part of called the Open Network, which I'm sure you guys have heard about, and it's such an important thing, what's going on in the Open Network. And I'll tell you why. It's important because I live in Kentucky in a small rural town called Morgantown. How many of you have heard of Morgantown? What? What did you do to who to have to know about Morgantown? That's crazy. Not many people, when I go places and talk to them, they don't really know about Morgantown. We're near Bowling Green, which is where they make Corvettes. That's kind of our claim to fame, is we're close to that. But for a long time, so I've been there since today actually makes 11 years in Morgantown for me. And so for us, it's been a journey over the last 11 years of rethinking, of questioning, of the old kind of ways we were taught and the old boxes we were given to put our faith and ideas of God. It just stopped working for lots of us. And, there was a period of time as I pastored this church where I was at best a functional atheist in some ways because what I'd been told God was no longer worked. And this journey for me has been learning that the boxes don't hold God. They're helpful at times. I'm grateful for being taught in ways, but they suddenly stopped working. And so when I hear about One Church and I hear what you guys are doing here, it's so encouraging to me because of what we're trying to do in Morgantown. And over the past year, we've connected with people like Ryan, churches like One Church, and there are little pockets of us all over the country. And here's why it's so important what we're doing, is because you guys are bringing the future into the present. Right? The things that you've taken bumps for, the things that you've been criticized for, the challenges you've faced for looking to create a more just and generous Christianity, those things are the future. That's where it's headed. In 50 to 100 years, people are going to say, gosh, I wish we'd gotten on board when one church did. And so we're trying to do that in Morgantown, and we're doing it imperfectly, and there are challenges. Facebook is great, but it also gives people free rein to just take shots at you all the time. And that's okay, because ultimately what I've realized is that when you're saying, it seems to be when you talk about God being love, that can really tick people off, which is odd, right? We're going to talk about peace a little bit today, and one of the things I tell my church every Advent on Peace Sunday, we talk about it quite a bit, but on Peace Sunday, one of the things I always say is I never get more angry comments than when I give a sermon about peace in the world, which seems just so counterintuitive. Let's talk about peace, and people want to punch you in the parking lot. Like, that doesn't make, did I not communicate well? So it's just it's a joy to be here, and it's a joy to get to be a part of this community. And I love my church, and I love being a part of my church, and I love being connected with those people. And it's just good to see other groups of people who are doing what we're doing. So thank you for having me here today. Thank you for being a part of this amazing thing right here in Chandler. And we were going to the zoo yesterday, and Cohen said, "It's really nice here. Do we have to leave?" And I said, I think there may be some people at home who would be a little disappointed if we didn't come back. So, but I hope this is not our only visit to Arizona. It's just absolutely beautiful. If you have a Bible, turn to Mark chapter 15. We're going to talk about a snippet of time in the last 24 hours of Jesus' life. But really, if you take into context the whole experience of Holy Week, which is that last week of Jesus' life, it really seems to me that it comes down to choices. There are choices being made. And I think we get this because most of our lives are all about choices. Every Sunday, my friend Brent has labeled Sunday, he calls it Sunday Fun Day. And usually he'll put a picture on Facebook that says it's Sunday Fun Day, right? Because Sunday we do church, and then there's a group of us, we go out to lunch every week. And we go somewhere different every week, and it's us and our kids, and it's this long process. So lunch for us is not just real quick. We spend about 2 hours wherever we are, eating and drinking and enjoying each other. But there's this moment, as much as I love that, there's this moment every Sunday when we finish our 10:30 service of existential horror, when somebody will ask the question, where are we going to go eat? And they inevitably ask me, and I got to tell you, I don't like making decisions very much, which is weird when you're a lead pastor. I don't like making decisions. I'd rather somebody else choose. But they're like, where are we going to go? And I've just internally begin to feel like I just want to run and hide. I don't want to deal with this. And then I'll throw something out, and somebody will say, no, we don't want to go there this week. And then we'll go, how many of you have this happen? You're going somewhere to dinner, and you ask your partner or you ask your kids, where do you want to eat? And they say, I don't care. And then you say, let's go here. And they're like, oh, I don't want to go there. Well, apparently you care, right? I mean, some choices are just existentially terrifying. Where are we going to eat? Then there are choices like, we're super excited about this Batman Superman movie coming out. Anybody else excited about Batman Superman movie? Not enough of you, so that's disturbing. We're Team Batman, and we're super excited. But now, it used to be what movie we're going to. Now it's, are we going to 3D or standard def? Right? So it's 3D or not 3D. That is the question every time you go to the movie. And now it's like IMAX 3D or regular 3D. So we're doing the IMAX 3D, and we've made that decision. And have you ever noticed how we talk to kids, and we ask kids, like my son's age and younger, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like we know, right? I'm not grown up yet. I don't know what I'm going to be when I'm grown up. I think people are hoping it happens at some point. I'm hoping it happens, but we just don't know yet what we're going to be, right? And we make all these difficult, but then there are really difficult choices. Like, how am I going to respond to the person who started that little morsel of gossip about me in the community? How am I going to respond to the person who cut me off in traffic? How am I going to respond to a friend when I feel like they've betrayed me? And then there are other important questions. What am I going to do with the energy and the creativity that God has given me in this world, in this brief moment of time that we have called life? What am I going to do with that? And we're making all these choices. And I think when it comes down to it, the story of Jesus in this last week of his life ultimately comes down to choices. And the choice they were struggling with in the first century of the Common Era was, how is peace going to come upon the earth? Because then, like now, most people wanted to figure out how to bring peace to the world. And then, like now, there were lots of competing ideas for how that would possibly happen. And in the last moments of Jesus' life, these different ideas of how peace would happen on earth begin to converge, and something terrifying, heartbreaking, horrendous, and yet in some ways it ends up being a beautiful thing happens. So I'm going to read from Mark chapter 15, beginning in verse 6. This is Jesus. He's being tried before Pilate, who is the Roman governor of Judea. During the festival, Pilate released one prisoner to them, whomever they requested. A man named Barabbas was locked up with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection, during an uprising. The crowd pushed forward and asked Pilate to release someone, as he regularly did. Pilate answered them, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" He's talking about Jesus. He knew that the chief priests had handed him over because of jealousy. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas to them instead. Pilate replied, "Then what do you want me to do with the one you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Why? What wrong has he done?" They shouted even louder, "Crucify him." Pilate wanted to satisfy the crowd, so he released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus whipped and handed him over to be crucified. So this moment, in the last 24 hours of Jesus' life, where he's being tried before Pilate, this Roman governor who was known to be brutal in history. We know him to be a brutal, brutal human being. And there's a choice to be made, Barabbas or Jesus. And Barabbas gets chosen and Jesus gets rejected. I want to talk about what that means, but first I want to give you a bit of context. Since the year 64 BC, the land of Judea had been run by the Romans. They took it over in 64 BC. But that was actually just the latest in a string of oppression that the Jewish people had faced. It began in Egypt, right? You've heard the story of Charlton Heston liberating the people from Egypt, right? You know that story pretty well. And so they were slaves in Egypt, and then God delivers them from Egypt. And what's so amazing about that story is in the ancient world, much like our world, people assumed that people on top of the pyramid of power, like had the most wealth, the most security, that God was on their side. And this story says that actually the people God is for, it's not for the people on top of the pyramid. The people God is for is the people on the bottom. God cares about the slaves. God cares about the poor. God cares about the oppressed. God cares about the abused and neglected. That's where God's heart is. And so God is moved and he delivers these slaves and they enjoy a bit of freedom. And then come the Assyrians, and then come the Babylonians, and then come the Persians, and then come the Greeks, and then the Romans. And so by the time the first century rolls around and Jesus is on the scene, the Jewish people have had the boot of one empire after another on the back of their necks. They knew a bit of freedom for about 100 years before Rome came to town, but it was all just taken away in a moment. And the question they're dealing with the entire time is, how is God going to make us free again? Because if God did it then, way back at Passover, the first Passover in Egypt, maybe God will do it now. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the last week of Jesus' life occurs around the season of Passover. There's a book I read every Holy Week by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Cross, and it's called The Last Week. I've read it every Holy Week for I guess close to 10 years now. And they begin their story of Palm Sunday by describing two different processions that entered the city of Jerusalem that day. And I want to read you just a snippet because it really gives you kind of a sense of what was going on. Two processions entered Jerusalem on a spring day in the year 30. It was the beginning of the week of Passover, the most sacred week of the Jewish year. In the centuries since, Christians have celebrated this day as Palm Sunday, the first day of Holy Week, with its climax on Good Friday and Easter. It is the most sacred week of the Christian year. One was a peasant procession, the other an imperial procession. From the east, Jesus rode a donkey down the Mount of Olives, cheered by his followers. Jesus was from the peasant village of Nazareth. His message was about the kingdom of God, and his followers came from the peasant class. On the opposite side of the city, from the west, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Idumea, Judea, and Samaria, entered Jerusalem. At the head of a column of imperial cavalry and soldiers, Jesus' procession proclaimed the kingdom of God. Pilate's proclaimed the power of empire. The two processions embody the central conflict of that week that led to Jesus' crucifixion. So do you get the story? On this day we celebrate as Palm Sunday, which happens in a few weeks. Jesus rides into town on a donkey, right? A bit of a lampoon of power, right? You know, because who rides into town on a donkey, honestly, right? And Pilate from the other side rides in on a war horse. And it's this central conflict. How does peace happen in the world? And it happens not just on a random Tuesday. It happens around Passover, a time when the Jewish people are going to be remembering and rehearsing and reciting their liberation from Exodus, right? From slavery in Egypt in the Exodus, right? They're remembering that we were slaves in Egypt and God had our back. And you've got to imagine that Passover was a very tense time to be a Roman in first century Judea. At the risk of quoting Bonnie Tyler, they were living in a powder keg and giving off sparks, right? That's exactly what's going on there. And that song is my gift to you. It'll be in your head on loop the rest of the day. They're really in a place where anything could happen. The tension is so heavy and so thick. What will happen? And essentially, I think it's in this sort of tense environment we see these three different responses, these three different paths to peace. The first is the path of who we'd call the Sadducees. They're essentially the temple authorities. And these temple authorities, so when it talks about the crowds, by the way, we get a bit of whiplash because on Sunday, Jesus is followed by the crowds, and they're celebrating Jesus. And people often say, oh, you know, he was celebrated on Sunday and they booed him on Friday. It's not actually true. This is not the same crowd, right? The peasant class would not be welcome in Pilate's kind of compound. This crowd is the religious elite. It's the temple authorities. It's the people who make sure that things at the temple go as things at the temple should go. And they don't like Jesus very much. Why don't they like Jesus very much? Jesus has been insisting that God doesn't need blood and a sacrifice on an altar to love us. Jesus keeps insisting that this whole temple system is on the way out. And actually something else, like you can find God, he insists, you can find God sharing bread and wine around a table. You don't need to find God in a sacred building. It's one of the things that drives me crazy when people refer to our church building as God's house. I'm like, God does not pay rent and he doesn't live in the back, right? This is not God's house. This is a building with a mortgage, and it's not where God lives. God lives everywhere. And if we can't figure that out in Arizona, I mean, have you seen what you see all the time? Have you paid attention? I mean, the mountains here, they're breathtaking. They're amazing. I mean, how many of us have ever walked outside and looked at a sunset and had this experience like, oh my goodness, we're not just molecules and random chance. There's something real and meaningful about being here in this beautiful world God has made. And Jesus keeps insisting that God doesn't live in a building, that God doesn't live in a box, that God doesn't need somebody to kill something in order to love us, that God loves us right where we are. Now, if you make your living based on the fact that people pay money to come and kill something, right? And if you make your living based on the fact that people are afraid and they're scared, and somebody comes along saying, fear not, you don't have to be afraid of God, that creates sort of a bit of tension for you, doesn't it? And so the religious leaders essentially, I think we have a quote from Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, where they said the temple authorities did not represent the Jews. Rather than representing the Jewish people, they were, as local collaborators with imperial authority, the oppressors of the vast majority of the Jewish people. So essentially the religious leaders who should have been advocating for the people discovered you can make a lot of money if you partner with the empire and oppress the people. Right? And so they essentially, now I don't know how politics in Arizona work. I know how politics in Kentucky work, but you're going to be shocked at this. Sometimes politicians get elected, and then instead of representing the people they're supposed to represent, they just get rich off special interest groups. I don't know if that happens in Arizona, but that happens in Kentucky. And it happened in the ancient world. These religious leaders are supposed to represent the people. And instead of representing the people, they're getting a wealthy kickback, a lot of money. The status quo becomes their friend. And I think anytime the status quo begins to change, anytime there's sort of this sense, and right, I think so for us, as we're beginning to talk about a more progressive, just and generous Christianity, right, that we feel drawn toward, that we feel this is the movement of the Spirit of God. Why do people resist that so strongly? Because when you start talking about a God that loves us, that we don't need to be afraid of, there are people who are making really good money peddling a God who we need to be afraid of. Right? And there's a lot to lose. There's a lot to lose for them. It's the same in the ancient world. So you have the religious leaders who decide the way we're going to keep the peace is we're not going to buck Rome. We're going to partner with Rome, and we're going to have a good life because we're partnering with Rome. And we'll still provide some services for the people. We'll still give them an outlet. But really, at the end of the day, it's about what's best for us. And so they chose the path of collaboration. And then you have Barabbas. And Barabbas chose the path of violence. So Barabbas is arrested because he killed people in a rebellion, which was common. In the year 4, so 4 BC, shortly around the time of Jesus' birth, there's a city near Nazareth where Jesus grew up called Sepphoris. Have you ever heard of Sepphoris? This was a Greek city but in Palestine, but it was a Greek constructed city. Some of the Jewish people there revolted, and the Roman general Varus came down from Syria, and they crucified more than 2,000 people in that rebellion. And the historian Josephus actually says that there weren't enough crosses for the bodies that they had to crucify. So it was one of the interesting common things is that you would have some uprisings because people believed if we're going to get rid of Rome, then we have to get rid of Rome. We have to kill them. The only way to win is to kill. And this is how most empires work, right? Rome worked this way. This is how, so what do you do when somebody rebels against you? You squash it, right? What do you do when somebody doesn't like your policies? You force them. What do you do when somebody disagrees? You just, in Rome's, you just kill them, right? You just kill them. And this is how Barabbas responded. Rome is oppressive. Rome is difficult. Rome is painful. And so Barabbas and people like Barabbas, you had people called the Zealots and those sorts of people who they just responded, we're going to fight fire with fire. We're going to give Rome what Rome has given us. And my goodness, did Rome know how to give pain and suffering to human beings. One of their own historians, a guy named Tacitus, put it like this. They rob, kill, and plunder, all under the deceiving name of Roman rule. They make a desert and call it peace. You get what he's saying? How does Rome bring peace, and how do people like Barabbas choose peace? We just kill all of our enemies, and when nobody's left to resist us, we say we've brought peace to the world. Right? It'd be like dropping a nuclear bomb and wiping everything out and saying, look, we made peace. But is that really peace? Can you kill your way to peace? I think what we've seen in the world, and almost all of our armed conflicts in the world, when they end, it's not really peace we've brought. It's one side had more weapons than the other, and they're going to go regroup. Right? And we've bought into this myth that eye for an eye is the best way to live. And in its ancient context, eye for an eye was actually quite brilliant. Because in the ancient world, let's say somebody killed your cow accidentally. You then would just retaliate by just like killing them. And eye for an eye says, whoa. You can only do something reciprocal. You can't overkill. Right? So if somebody cuts off your hand, you can't cut off their head. That's not the same. Right? So if somebody cuts off your hand, you cut off their hand. If somebody gouges out your eye, you gouge out their eye. And it was supposed to limit violence. But it didn't. And so Jesus comes along. What does Jesus say? In Kentucky, Jesus says, y'all have heard it said, but I say to you, you've heard it said, eye for an eye, but I say to you, love your enemies. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. So, eye for an eye, Jesus says, doesn't work. And it doesn't, does it? Think about this. How many of you, if somebody walked up to you right after the service, maybe out in the parking lot here, and they just smacked you in the face, even if you knew you deserved it, how many of you would respond, thanks, I deserve that? What would you do? You would probably smack them back maybe twice, and then it would just keep going until you're rolling around. I saw this video somebody put on Facebook yesterday of these two women fighting in Walmart. I don't even know what they were fighting. I don't know what they were fighting, but they're down on the ground, hitting each other's shampoo bottles. Like how does that begin? Like, at what point are you like, I need celery, I need broccoli, and I'm going to beat that person up? Like, I don't know how that happens at Walmart. But eye for an eye doesn't work. It doesn't stop there. Somebody says something about you, gossips about you, you gossip about them, but then do they say, okay, you're right, you got me back, we're even? No, they up the ante. They punch you, you punch them. They don't say, you got me. They throw another punch. And the reality is that the path Barabbas chose ultimately keeps it going. The path of violence never stops violence. You can't kill your way to peace in the world. And that's true globally, but that's true interpersonally. Right? You can't retaliate your way into harmony and reconciliation and peaceful relationships. It just doesn't work that way. And yet so many people choose the path of Barabbas. It's easier in some regards on the outset. You can feel really justified rallying people around your enemies. Actually, in human history, religion has been a really good rallier of people against their enemies. You pick a group of people you disagree with, you find some random Bible verse to shame them, and you say, if you don't agree with us, then you're excluded and you're out and you're not welcome here. Right? Hasn't that been in some ways the checkered history? Now, religion has brought a lot of good things to the world, but it also has this checkered past where it brings some of the same people we can approach. Some people look at religion and Christianity and faith and they see love and compassion and they go out and they give their lives in service to the poor. Some people see something far different that leads them to spew hate and exclusion and make the world worse. There's this great line in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, where Paul's talking about the Eucharist, and he says to the church in Corinth, he says, listen, when you guys get together, it's bad for the world. Like, can you imagine somebody reviewing your church Facebook page and saying, look, I'm just going to tell you straight off, when you guys get together, the world gets worse. Like, that's not really something you want to hear about your community, but that's how they were living, and that's how religion can be if we let it. And it can lead us to do things and say things that we would never imagine. I was in a conversation with somebody years ago, but I think this conversation could still be happening all over the place today. And somebody said to me, I think one day we're going to have to respond to Muslims how the Israelites responded to the Canaanites. And if you don't know that story, they're talking about genocide. And they're using the Bible to justify genocide. I mean, the path of Barabbas is alive and well. The path of Rome is alive and well because essentially Barabbas and Rome choose the same path. They make a desert and call it peace. We'll kill our way to peace. And then you have the path of Jesus, which was the path of nonviolence. Jesus rides into Jerusalem not on a war horse, but on a donkey. Right? Jesus rides into Jerusalem not to conquer, but in peace, ultimately to be executed. This is the same Jesus, by the way, who said that God's kids are peacemakers, who told us to pray for those who persecute us, who reminded us that God's good and generous rain falls on the good, bad, and ugly alike. That God's posture toward the world is one of love. This is the Jesus who went around placing his hands on lepers and forgiving and restoring prostitutes and sitting down with tax collectors and sinners. This is that Jesus who chose not to kill his way to peace, but to embody peace and to give himself in love for his enemies and for the world. Paul says in 1 Corinthians again that the cross, the message of the cross is foolishness on the outside. Why is the message of the cross foolishness? Why? I'll tell you why. It's the same reason people get upset when you talk about peace in the world. Because when you talk about not retaliating against your enemies, but loving your enemies, when you take Jesus seriously and you talk about turning the other cheek as opposed to retaliating, that seems pretty dumb on the surface, doesn't it? The cross is foolishness, but the cross, for Paul, is not just an implement of death, it is an implement of life. Right? It's where God displays God's true nature to the world. What is God really like? God is like a man dying on a cross, forgiving his enemies. That's what God is like. And I think it's kind of brilliant the way Mark constructs this story and the way Mark puts this story in place because essentially this was the choice facing the Jewish people in the year 66. Right? In the year 66, the people of Judea decided to rebel against Rome violently. And Rome came in and crushed it, burned the temple to the ground, and utterly destroyed the city. And I think in some ways, Mark wrote around 70, Mark is saying, we backed the wrong candidate. We went with the path of Barabbas, and we should have chose the path of Jesus. We decided to see what our weapons could get us, and now we know. The temple's burned to the ground. The city's been destroyed. Countless of our brothers and sisters have been executed. I think we see where the path of Barabbas gets us in the world. And I think that's an important lesson in history, right? We look back on that and we realize the path of Jesus would have, actually Jesus rides into Jerusalem in Luke and he weeps over the city and says, if you only knew what peace looked like. If you only knew. But they didn't know. And I would argue that we don't know today. I think if we want these stories in the Bible to be powerful, we have to ask the question, if they made the wrong choice then, is it possible we're making the wrong choice now? And I think we can think about this globally. Right? We live in a world that has been racked by war. There's pain all over the world. There's violence. Right now today, while we're kind of in the safety and comfort of this moment, there are people dying in violent conflicts all over the world. So my son for Christmas got a drone, that we try to fly in our backyard, and it doesn't go so well, but we do it, and it's very resilient. It can take some nose dives into the ground. But one of the things I always think about is, for us in the U.S., we buy drones for our kids as toys. And there are kids in other parts of the world, when they hear a drone coming, that means something else. Are you with me? That isn't a toy. That's something that very likely is going to end their life. We live in a world where this idea of war, and we live right now in a country where you have lots and lots of people who are just sounding that call for more and more and more violence as if it's worked before. What is our responsibility as people of the way of Jesus in that? What is our responsibility in a world that seems to be pushing itself to the brink of war? And by the way, we have more ways of killing each other creatively now than we ever have in human history. What is our responsibility? But then if we could think about it perhaps one-on-one, what is our responsibility to respond to our enemies? How do we respond? Right? What are we going to do? Are we going to choose the path of Barabbas? Are we going to push back on them what they've pushed onto us? Or are we going to seek in the way of Jesus some creative way to assert our dignity and assert our humanity, but at the same time not devalue the humanity in them? I think that's what always happens. When we begin to devalue the humanity of another human being, we devalue and diminish our own humanity. Does that make sense? Like when I begin to see you not as a human being made in the image of God, deeply loved by God, but when I begin to see you as a problem that needs to be solved, and by solved I mean taken out, however that is, whether it's socially, whether it's physically, like whatever that means. When I see you as that kind of problem, I no longer see you as an image bearer of God in the world. One of the things we talk about at our church is before we see each other as anything, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Democrat, Republican, UK fans are crazy, and the Louisville fans are crazy, and I don't like any of them. But anyway, before we begin to see people in those categories, before we label one another gay or straight or whatever, we're human beings. We're all these deeply spiritual realities trapped and living and gifted with this flesh and blood and bone. Can you imagine what it would be like if we looked at our enemies and saw a human being that God loved? It doesn't mean what they've done is right. It doesn't mean there doesn't need to be a conversation. It doesn't mean you don't need to have boundaries. There's this great line in Proverbs that says a dog returns to its vomit, but it doesn't command you to stand around the vomit waiting for the dog to come back, right? There's these things called boundaries where destructive, toxic people have to be kind of pushed aside a little bit, and you need space and safety from them. What are we going to do about our enemies? Are we going to do the hard work of Jesus, the hard work of the cross, where we essentially, instead of pushing pain back on them, we absorb it and try to find a creative way to deal with it? Or are we going to do to them what they've done to us and keep it going on? So to give you I live in south central Kentucky now, but I'm from eastern Kentucky, West Virginia border. I'm from Hatfield-McCoy country. All right, how many of you have heard of the Hatfield-McCoy feud? Over a pig is what they say, which I know it meant something different now than it does then. Right now we just think bacon. Right? Then it meant something a little different. But I'm from a part of the world where I've seen what these interpersonal conflicts, I've heard stories about, I've toured sites of where these little squabbles can lead us in the world. How are we going to respond to our enemies? How are we going to respond to the inequality in the world? Are we going to take the path of the Sadducees that says, actually how the world works right now works really good for me? Because when people start talking about the poor being raised up and good news being proclaimed to the poor, which I think that would always be that you're going to be able to eat now, right? That's good news for the poor. That's going to affect my bottom line, right? Because I'm going to have to do something with my resources other than just consume it all. Am I going to choose the path as the Sadducees and say, look, business is working for me right now. I hope they get what they need. Am I going to choose the path of Jesus? What about when it comes to the injustice of the world? Are we going to stand up in a Jesus sort of way and say, no, it's wrong. Injustice is wrong. In every way, shape, and form, injustice is wrong, and it's bad for the world, and it's not God's dream for the world. Are we going to do that? Or are we going to perpetuate the cycles and systems? And how are we going to do it? Sometimes I see people saying really beautiful things, but then sometimes I see people standing up for the right causes, and they're calling people dummy and idiot and all sorts of names. Like, are we going to take that path that further divides, or are we going to take the path of Jesus where we seek to meet people where they are with grace and understanding and compassion and invite them to take a step forward? About a month ago, I was in New York City, and I hadn't been to New York. By the way, every time I say that, I think of that Pace Picante commercial. Do you guys think of New York City? Like I think of that every time. I hadn't been to New York City in 20 years. I went there in high school on a field trip, which was a pretty great field trip. But adult Josh had not been to New York City. And so I went to New York City and had a great week with some friends. We were dreaming about sort of some of this open stuff and what it was going to look like to be a progressive evangelical and how do we do that. But I landed at LaGuardia, and I realized when I landed, I had no plan to get to the hotel. And so I thought, I've got to, and I had never done Uber at that point, and so I didn't even have the app on my phone. So I literally just walked to the area where people are standing, and some guy says to me, "You want to ride?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." My friends later who lived there said, "You could have ended up like floating at the bottom of the Hudson River. Like, that was a bad choice." And I realized it was a bad choice once I got in the car. And this guy, I mean, literally, I was saying every prayer I knew to pray for safety. Like, he's driving like a maniac. We're going everywhere. And I'm a super introvert. This is different gear for me. In my everyday life, I'm an introvert. If I go to a party, I don't know people, I'll sit there and just watch. Super introverted. And so talking to new people is sometimes, especially like it's a little bit of a challenge. And so, but I'm realizing this may be the last human being I ever talk to. So I want this conversation to count. And I find out who he is and where he's from. He actually was from the Dominican Republic, and we have a partnership there. And so we were talking about places in the Dominican Republic we knew about similarly, and we were sharing those stories. And maybe because there was familiarity, he didn't kill me. I don't know. But as we're driving, he says, "What do you do?" And can I tell you, as a pastor, when people ask me that question on an airplane, in an elevator, in a car going 75 miles an hour down a street in New York City, I don't like to answer that question honestly, because it gets weird for everybody. So I've tried to find creative ways of saying, like, but then I just feel like I don't know what to say that's going to be helpful. I'm not like, I'm in PR for God. Like, that doesn't make sense. So I said, well, to be honest, I'm a pastor of a church, and I'm in New York for some meetings about how we can do things differently. And he says, "Oh, really?" He said, I'm not religious. I was religious growing up, and I have lots of friends who are religious. And can I tell you that they're all jerks? But he didn't use the word jerk. I'll let you creatively go where you want with that. It was much more, a little saltier than jerk. And he said, they're all jerks, and I would not want to have anything to do with that at all. And so I said, look, that's why we're here, because there's some of us who don't want to be jerks anymore. And we want to create a faith that is, I think, always been there and always been true and always been God's intention. A place where people could come broken and busted, hurting, confused, doubting, questioning, believing, atheist, agnostic, like whatever the label, they could come and they could find a welcome and love and acceptance. And I think the way we do that is we choose this path of Jesus. The path of Jesus leads to a just and generous faith. The path of Jesus leads to healing and wholeness. This path Jesus embodied is not the easiest path, but my goodness, I think many of us have found that this is the path that leads to wholeness and life, and it's good for the world.